Voter suppression is not new. It's been part of the American political dynamic since the end of Reconstruction and the passage of the 15th Amendment. Last week, the state of Georgia added its own chapter to this openly regressive and racist book. Welcome once again to Ask a Black Dude. Today we'll be discussing this new law, its ins and outs, how it affects us today, and what we can do to keep this from happening again. My guest, you guys have seen him before. He's been on here with the Downward Republic Conversation. If you have not seen that, go check that out on the channel. He is a Cooley Law School graduate, alum. He works at a law clerk in Western Michigan. Keith Brown, brother, how you doing?
Great, sir. How are you?
You know what? It's Saturday morning. I'm in this kind of setup the way I got going on, and I'm glad my internet is working. So I'm pretty happy right now.
Hey, that's a win.
It is a win. So Georgia's new law, the F.
Yeah, basically. Yeah.
So I'm one of these people who like I know things kind of politically, but not everything politically, right? Like my political intelligence is probably not up to part of what it should be. In a state that openly swung the presidential election in 2020, which helped Joe Biden to win, the talk was Georgia is now become a blue state, or I've heard Georgia is now a purple state. So with Georgia swinging the way it did, how did this particular law, this voter law happen? Like, how did this come to be in the first place?
Well, what you saw was this is in Georgia and also across the country, right? You saw vast changes to voting in 2020, largely due to COVID, but also because of the overall push for mail-in voting, and no reason absentee voting over the last couple of years. Like here in Michigan, we had, I believe it was in 2016, 2018, I don't remember. The voters passed no reason absentee voting, and that became a thing. So there was an overall push for that. Some states had already developed universal mail-in voting. Colorado, Oregon, Utah, and Florida. Florida's not universal, but close. But Utah, Colorado, and Oregon, and Washington, I believe. Universal mail-in voting. So there was an overall push, but then COVID really pushed everything further. Some of the states changed their laws with the legislature level. Some governors tried to pass emergency rules. Some state secretary of states did, who are generally in charge of elections operations in those states, did some things unilaterally. And in some states, state Supreme Courts changed the rules. Some states, federal district courts changed the rules. So it was really all over the board and how everything happened. But what we saw was also at the same time, we saw the equivalent rhetoric and narrative from one side, and really from one politician in particular, that absentee voting and mail-in voting in particular. Actually, there was a distinction there between absentee voting and mail-in voting.
Okay.
The purpose behind why they were saying it that way was rife with fraud, right? And people bought into this narrative, right? And now we have, the narrative of the stolen election, of fraud that happened, and a lot of states controlled by Republican legislatures have taken up that mantle, and they already pre-2020 were passing laws to make voting harder, right? We saw this in Ohio, with them purging, making it easier for the state to purge voters from voting rolls, and they got held up in federal courts for, just purging, people without notice, basically,
right.
After not voting in like one election. It was draconian. But we really saw this really amp up after the 2020 election. We saw, with these tight states where just a few votes can make a difference. Georgia being one of them, North Carolina. North Carolina has been the epicenter of this for several years now.
Mm-hmm.
Arizona, Florida with Amendment 4 from a couple years ago. This is all just a big part of this larger narrative that has really been partisanized and used by one wing of one party to really find their narrative that, you know, the other side is doing mischievous things and stealing elections from them.
Well, you bring up that point because I mean that's always, I don't know if it's been maybe since the 70s, if maybe you could pinpoint that, but there's been a point where you always had one side that always tried to stop you from voting. And there was always the other side that please come and vote. And the other side was like, no, we're going to find ways to make it hard to vote. I'll let people try to figure out which side, we're talking about. You know what I mean?
Well, and people will, and let's just go there, right? Like people will come back with, well, all of the, you know, the Voting Rights Act was passed in response to efforts of Democrats in the South and Jim Crow, right? The South is blue until the Voting Rights Act passes.
And then it flips.
Right? And Nixon's very open about this, going out of this other states. You know, they took Lyndon Johnson, the Texas Democrat, to get enough Southern Texas Democrats to side with, you know, the Voting Rights Act. Strom Thurmond famously filibustered it from South Carolina, the Democrat, at the time. And then they all switched parties, right? And you still see this, you know, in like Arkansas local politics, everybody's still Democrats. They just don't vote for Republicans statewide, or don't vote for, they vote Republican statewide and presidential. But even like 10 years ago, everybody statewide in Arkansas was a Democrat, right? I mean, Bill Clinton was from Arkansas.
Right.
But and then you saw the flip. And then what happened was in several years ago now, in Shelby County versus Holder, Texas got Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act ruled unconstitutional. Chief Justice Roberts said that Section 5, which required states with a history of discrimination, only states that had a history of discrimination, which, and you know, in terms of the act, was the South. Even though there's a good argument that northern states have done it too, right?
Yes. Yes.
Not pretend that northern states are innocent here. Section 5 requires those states to go to the federal government for permission to change their voting laws. Chief Justice Roberts ruled it unconstitutional, and then it spurred, you know, all of these, the ability for all of these states to now just pass voting laws that they could do before: Texas, Georgia, North Carolina, Alabama. Less so Arizona, probably. Florida, you know, Alabama. So we've seen this push spiral, and then 2020 was just the culmination of this ever-rising narrative tied into what is essentially one man's ego, right? They used it as, you know, lies, fraud, mostly without evidence.
Right.
That in Georgia, we'll see this in Georgia, we talk about later. Some of it comes down to one man's ego.
Well, I mean, I guess all it really takes, I mean, if the last 4 years has taught us anything, all it takes is one man's ego to kind of flip the board. You know, the flip of Democrats and Republicans in the South is in itself is an interesting conversation. In itself is an interesting discussion, because my role model Malcolm X famously called them the Southern Dixiecrats. You know what I'm saying? He's right. You know, he said that there is the only difference between a wolf and a fox is a wolf will come into the hen house through the front door and a fox will come through the back, but they're both part of the canine family, right? They both do things that on either side is not beneficial to whatever your belief system is. The problem is they spend too much time pointing at each other and say, look, they're bad. No, they're bad. No, they're bad. No, they're bad. And the problem is things like this happen where this voting law kind of slips in and like people are like, whoa, what just happened? Because part of that with Georgia, who is 33% black, like people have really I don't know, misunderstanding is not the right word, but they really don't understand how black the South is. Like Alabama is 36, is 30. What I have here. Alabama is 27% black. Mississippi is 38% black. Yet these
comparison, what are Michigan and Illinois doing?
What's that?
Like what are Michigan and Illinois? It's not even close to that.
No, it's not even close. I think Michigan's maybe like what 15% or 20%. I didn't look those states up, but they're nowhere near how high. And this is 30, 38, 33, 30. This is after black people left in the 50s and 60s.
Right. And during the time of the Civil War, the numbers were basically even.
They were basically even, right?
Not the black population being 30, right?
So for Georgia to pass this law, you need all the white people to be on the same side, or the majority of white people on the same side. So, but let's dive into the nitty gritty of this law, because the absentee ballots, that is a huge part of how Biden and how Georgia swung blue, at least in the presidential election. 1.3 million Georgians voted by absentee ballots. That's 26.
Yeah, right.
Which is 26% of the state's electorate voted with absentee ballots. Biden had, I think it was like 55 or 60% of those votes. They basically, with this new law, have taken the time that you can put in for an absentee ballot or submit your absentee ballot from 6 months to 3 months. What is the effect of this being cut in half? How does this affect the voter numbers turnout when it comes to, hey, instead of having 20-30% voter, now it might drop? Like how devastating is that for the absentee ballots?
Well, and as we'll see with all of these, some of them will be more stark than others. Some of them, these restrictions will seem as an isolated provision to maybe have a small marginal effect, right? Like you can say, okay, well, what was this? You still have 3 months, right? Okay, is that reasonable? Probably. But think about this past year, people that's the voting rights organizations start getting people to sign up for their absentee ballots months and months at a time. 3 months is, barely before primaries,
right?
For the general, right? So, this one may be one of the more marginal restrictions, but what it will happen is it will reduce at some level the number of people that get to request their ballot, get their application. The system of getting there. I remember this past year I got mail after just stacks of mail. I think I have a couple of them just for the streets of people sending me applications of absentee ballots. Right, of course we get official ones from Michigan here, but it'll reduce those efforts and make those efforts a little more complicated. And I mean, who does that hurt? That's where the conundrum always is a district that can tackle a lot of these things. And this one might be less so than the others, but who has got to suffer the most from that kind of restriction? It's going to be your low information voters, your voters that have less contact with your low involvement voters, your voters that don't seek out politics on a daily basis, more than a couple of the election. Those people tend to be poorer, so that might be more of an economic thing.
You mentioned the restrictions of that. Something that kind of stood out to me, and it's one of those things where, because we, you and I and other people don't have to deal with this problem, we don't see it as a problem. But Georgia added stricter ID requirements for the absentee ballots. Like, you have to show your obviously your name, address, all that stuff, your driver's license information, pint of blood, birth certificate, a virgin if you can find one. Like, this might seem something small to people who've had their driver's license since they were 16 years old, who had a state ID. But how difficult will this make the process for those who don't have this to go get, to fill in an ID, a ballot?
So what the law does is it now requires a voter in Georgia who wants to vote absentee to show the number on their Georgia driver's license or their state identification card. And then I believe like it has to be photocopied by the polling place or by the city clerk. So that's an extra step, right? And there's, anecdotes of, like mayors of towns be like, I forgot my ID, which you have to vote, and I have to go back home, right? Like normal people forget their ID sometimes. But besides just that, like IDs aren't free. And most voting rights organizations will say that the big problem with voting with ID laws is they're just not free, and which poll taxes are unconstitutional.
Yes.
So cost involved in voting is essentially a poll tax, and that's a big argument. The people that don't have IDs are people who don't drive, right? They don't have a driver's license, so they're more likely to be poor. It's not universal, but more likely. And again, the poor Americans who don't have time to go, or don't have transportation to go to the Secretary of State and get an ID, don't have the $25 or $50 or whatever it is to get an ID. And it doesn't affect the normal person who commutes and has to carry their license with you every day. And then it also affects like people in big cities. Like this is a lot of people. This is don't realize this, but a lot of people in large cities don't have cars and driver's licenses, and there's not a thing to do, right? Like in New York, people don't have driver's licenses, right? And you don't have any reason to have a car, right?
Right.
That culture is foreign to most of us. A lot of people live that way. I have a lot of friends who, they have no reason to drive. They live in downtown Grand Rapids, and everything they do is within a mile of, their house, and they take Uber or the downtown public buses, free to get around, right? They don't leave their little half-mile vicinity. So all of that comes with a problem.
So what you mentioned that the inconvenience of that that just adds to it. And like you said before, a lot of these things are just small stacks, right? They're just small things to make it just that much harder, right? These isn't like I said, the poll tax, which got eliminated with the 24th Amendment, right? This isn't the openly, hey, we're gonna have a grandfather clause, to whereas, if your grandfather can vote, for those who don't know, in Jim Crow era America, especially in the South, they had these clauses and these like literacy tests where, hey, if you can read this sentence or read this paragraph, you can vote. The problem is a lot of the slaves who were just freed could not read. And so
legally it was illegal for them to read.
It was illegal for them to read, so they could not vote. The grandfather clause, where it was, hey, if your grandfather voted, then you could vote. The problem is a lot of the just freed slaves, grandfathers were slaves. Thus, they could not vote. Thus, those people could not vote. And it pushed a lot of that progress back after Reconstruction. Man, one day we can dive into Reconstruction and how America would probably be a more advanced place than what it is now if Reconstruction hadn't ended when it did, and if Woodrow Wilson had never existed. But that's a conversation for a different day. You had a polar intimidation where people would stand, these groups would stand, like Tammany Hall would stand at the ballot boxes to make sure people didn't vote. So with that being said, you get situations part of with the ID requirements that make it so much harder. We do take that for granted here in Michigan because we are the Motor City state, right? We are the state that promotes having vehicles. To be honest, we don't have the best public transit situation, right? I know they were trying to do that with the People Mover and I can't remember which billionaire here is trying to promote that monorail that's trying to go from here to Ann Arbor. But we don't have the best. We're very car related, huh? Is that Mike Illich?
Isn't the Q line? Is the Q line?
Is that
Gilbert?
Yep, one of them. One of the billionaires with that own half Detroit, right? So
one of the two on top.
right, but with added added steps, and another step that they added or take away is Dropboxes, right? So part of the big push, and a lot of this is, like you said, a lot of this is in response to the 2020 election. A lot of this is, hey, there was voter fraud and this, that, and the third, even though there was no evidence for it, even though a lot of the evidence that they say happened didn't happen in Georgia, if it happened at all. But Dropboxes is a big part of people's voting process because, hey, not a lot of people have time because they work in factories, because they, have different working situations, can just pop off and just, drop, go vote between hours of 9 to 5 or whatever situation is. Across the 4 metro Atlanta areas, right? So you got Fulton, Cobb, DeKalb, and Gwinnett. I know if you are from Georgia and Atlanta and you see this video and I am pronouncing half of these wrong, feel free to butcher me, please. Just kill me, because that way I know how to say it right. But in 2020, they had 94 drop boxes. This new law chops that to 23. There are no more 24-hour boxes. The boxes are only inside government buildings, making evenings and other non-business hours. It just takes it away. Again, when you're talking about a state that had only 11,000 votes was the difference between Biden and Trump in that state swinging. Man, how huge is that with these drop boxes?
Well, I mean, the key there, the number of drop boxes is huge, right? From 94 to at max 23, right? That's huge. But the biggest one is the time, right? Mm-hmm. They have to be inside government buildings, which are only open. I work. All government employees will tell you we work basically 9 to 5.
Basically 9 to 5.
Monday through Friday. Mm-hmm. Which, if you're relying on a Dropbox, you're probably relying on a Dropbox because you can't get into go see your city to go vote at the city clerk 9 to 5 on Friday. You're not going to take the hour leave from your job on Wednesday afternoon to go vote. You got to take leave, or you got to take your kids, or most, or assuming people have leave of their jobs, people don't, right? Mm-hmm. Willing to do this, they're costing themselves, either money or leave time to do this. If you're using, the purpose of using the Dropbox is that it's not 9 to 5 on Monday through Friday.
Right.
This is essentially taking the purpose away from them and saying, no, we're still allowing Dropboxes. You're really not, right? Like that's no different than walking into your county clerk, city clerk's office and dropping off your ballot. This essentially turns it into the same function, right? So in all reality, it almost eliminates the purpose of the Dropboxes. Again, 11,000 votes, right? And when you think of 11,000 votes in Georgia, we think about this, Biden basically won by 7 to 8 million popular votes nationwide. Mm. In all reality, it was 11,000 votes in Georgia and a similar-ish number in Arizona.
Yep.
If those votes had not been in those 2 states, we would have had the Supreme Court would have at least heard the Pennsylvania case, right?
Yep.
Because it would have came down to Pennsylvania. Now, how the Supreme Court would have ruled on that is a different conversation, but we would have at least had the narrative of the election coming down to Pennsylvania, right? This is so much closer than everyone thinks it is, right? Mm-hmm. This is what's, we go back to the motivations behind the cause. The election was a lot closer than it actually looked.
Yeah, and it was one of those, man. I can say something right now, man. This past election, I have great people can't see because I shave it. I have gray hairs all of my beard just from the 2020 election, right? Just how crazy everything is. We was all on pins and needles, waiting to see what was gonna happen. Because if whoever was gonna win, we didn't know what was gonna happen. You know what I mean, with this election, and because of how close it was, part of what helped those 11,000 votes or 12,000 votes was mobile voting centers, right? Mobile RVs that will go around and stuff. That's essentially gone with this new law. They essentially ban that practice or outlaw that practice unless the governor declares a state of emergency and says, "Hey, yeah, go ahead and do that." Which again, another piece of that pie, another drop on that bucket. The problem
which these two RVs that were basically mobile polling places operated in Fulton County, which is Atlanta. 11,200 people voted at these.
Yes.
That's your margin.
That's your margin.
And so you combine that, these operated in Fulton County, so your largest county in the state, right? With the elimination of the drop boxes in the 4 metro Atlanta counties. Where are these restrictions taking place? Where are the election law changes taking place?
And see, I'm glad you bring that part up, because people will watch this and people will see it's like, well, how is this racist? Right? How is this targeted? Fulton County is 43% Black, with 440,000 Black residents in its county. It is 43% Black.
It's not only just 40% Black, but even whites in urban counties vote more Democratic.
Yes.
And their rural white colleagues, right?
Yeah. The Cobb is second at 390,000 African American Black residents in its county, and that's 53% of the county's population. So when people say, "Hey," yeah,
Fulton County 72-26, Biden Trump. DeKalb County 83-15. Where are the other three here? Cobb 56-42. So that's your closest. That's your smallest of the 4. And Gwinnett 58-40. So I mean, these are beyond your margin, right?
Right.
So even the demographic mix, this means that the white vote in those counties is more Democratic than there in the outlying counties, right? And that's not surprising, as it is how it is around the country, right? Urban and suburban whites are more Democratic than rural whites.
Listen, we've been beating around the bush. We've been teasing everybody with the appetizers. Let's go get into meat and potatoes. How stupid is this food and water? This food and water part of the bill. Now, for those who don't know, it's not specifically food and water, but basically, bear with me. Let me get in. So, with this new law, offering food and water as well as other solicitation is a part of this revision. It can bring misdemeanor charges, right? So if you basically, to kind of sum it up, if you are not voting, right, you are not in a voter line, you have to stay 150 feet from the outermost part of the polling building and 25 feet from any voters that are in line, right? So I remember when I went to go vote, I need to stop doing that. I remember when I went to go vote, and I was walking up the line, someone handed, a card with, the districts who was running for, the city council and the district and all that stuff, and you look at it, okay, cool, whatever, right? And that was it. Now that person could get misdemeanor charges for just being right there. But the part about the food and the water, that's the thing that kind of got everyone up in arms. Keith, how dumb is this? What are we doing?
So the basics, and this is one of those, the underlying purpose, the general purpose of this is fine, right? And it's something that most states do, is entirely constitutional. What they've added to it and what people assume their intent is behind it is the problem, right? So, most states have a law, no electioneering within 100 feet of the polling place. So if your guy comes to you and hands you a flyer, he's got to stand 101 feet away from the polling place for him to do that, right? He can't stand there. Minnesota famously just had a Supreme Court case, a Minnesota law that said you couldn't wear a political your clothing within 100 feet of the polling place couldn't have a political message on it, right? So you couldn't wear a Trump t-shirt into the polling place, or I think Michigan has a similar law, you can't walk in and have a Biden t-shirt on or wear a Biden hat in the polling place. Now, some people got clever. I know someone wearing a Colin Kaepernick jersey into the polling place, which highly clever, right? Because non-political, but everyone knows it is.
Everyone knows what it is, right?
But it's just a sports jersey, right? So the underlying restriction here is totally fine. It's a time, place, manner restrictions is all solid First Amendment law. But when you start adding, you can't give food or water, right? This is what everyone's paying attention to. Now, let's remember that James Madison's election campaigns used to give out whiskey at polling place. And within 25 feet of any voter standing in line, right? So if the line stretches out, you're gonna go back. Now, the statistic I believe, and I'm gonna be, forgive me if I'm off with this word, but the percentage of white voters in Georgia who stood in the line for more than an hour was like 6% or so. It was a very low number. The percentage of African American voters in Georgia who stood in line for more than an hour was a much higher number.
Right? And that's key, because in Georgia, you could have wait lines as long as 2 hours. In these
probably longer than that.
Longer than that.
6 hours in some places, right?
Right. Yeah, I mean, according to the Bipartisan Policy Center, like over 500,000 or close over 500,000 people, 560,000 people to be exact, said that they deterred them from voting because of how long these lines are and other, poll policy management in the building and stuff. But now, how big? I mean, that's a big difference when you're standing in line for 2, 3, and this is Georgia heat, folks. This ain't Michigan. This is Georgia, South, June, July, August heat. I'm in line for 2 hours and I can't get somebody some water. Come on, man.